We continue now at the top of Daf Pei Aleph Amud Beis in Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 81b. On the previous Amud, the Gemara brought a machlokas amoraim with regards to the shiyore hadam, the remainder of the blood, which is supposed to be poured to the base of the mizbeach. The question is whether instead of pouring it to the base of the mizbeach, let's say somebody would sprinkle it on the lower half of the mizbeach and then it would drip down to the base of the mizbeach. Would that be the same thing or not? That was a machlokas amoraim, and the Gemara is in the middle of bringing a proof from a brisa. The brisa brings a pasuk by Carbon which says the word dam twice, and so the brisa continues, Ma Talmud lomar dam dam. Why does the pasuk say dam twice? Shayachol, because one might think ein li ela elu shenisarvu b'tmurasa. One might only think, let's say you have a carbon that gets mixed up with its substitute carbon, so essentially they are the same carbon. Sha'af mechayim tekarev, there even if they get mixed up while the animals are alive, the karbanos, the animals, can still be offered. Minayin l'rabos toda ushlamim, from where do we know to include, let's say, a toda and a shlamim getting mixed up with an ola? Marba ani toda ushlamim sheboin beneder unadava kamosa. And the brisa goes further. I understand that I can include a toda and a shlamim because those can be donated just like a carbon ola can be donated. So maybe there we understand if it gets mixed up, they can still be offered. Minayin l'rabos as a asham, from where do we know to include even the asham, the guilt offering? Marbani as a asham shatan matan dalad kamoso. And the brisa says further, I understand that I can include the carbon asham that requires 4 applications of blood, like the carbon ola. Bechoru meiser pesach minayin. How do I know this would be true by the bechor, or by meiser behem, or by carbon pesach? Talmud lomar dam dam. The pasuk says dam twice, and therefore that is an inclusion. And so the Gemara now says, my lav, is it not? Sof ola. Ubechor, what we're talking about in this brisa is sof ola, that's the end blood of the carbon ola, the remainder blood, the shiyare hadam, and bechor. Ushma minon, we see from here that you are allowed to apply the blood just like you would apply it by bechor, and it's fine that it drips down to the base of the mizbeach. So ushma minon, we see from here, makom ola, makom shirayim, that the same place where you apply the blood of a carbon ola, the lower half of the mizbeach, is also fine for makom shirayim. That's also fine for the place where you're going to pour the remnant blood. You can again sprinkle the blood at the lower half of the mizbeach and let it drip down to the base of the mizbeach. And the Gemara says, lo, no, that's not the meaning of the brisa at all. Tchilas ola ubechor. The brisa means, again, the initial application of the blood by ola, the initial application of the blood by bechor, since they're applied in the same place, so they can be applied in this situation where the blood gets mixed up. And the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, that seems obvious. Umay kamash malon. So what's the brisa teaching us? De'ein olin mevatlin zezeh. That again, those items, so to speak, that ascend to the mizbeach, they're not mevatel one another. This is the source for that idea. And the Gemara asked the same question it asked on the previous Amud, but mi velokach midam hapor midam harsar nafka. Isn't that learned from a different pasuk? By Yom Kippur it says that they mix together the blood of the bull and the blood of the he-goat, and again that's going to be applied all together. You see, they're not mevatel one another. And the Gemara says the same as it said on the previous Amud, Tanoihi, that's a machlokas Tanoim, where to learn this idea out from. Where do we learn out this idea that ein olin mevatlin zezeh, ika denafkale mehacha, v'ika denafkale mehacha. Some learn it from here, some learn it from here, and so at this point in time, the Gemara has now brought 3 different sources for this same idea. And Rashi explains, Talmud lomar dam dam, the pasuk says dam twice, sheyachol ein li ela elu yikravu, sha'afim nisarvu mechayim yikravu, minayin afilu nisariv asham, v'chulu Talmud lomar. Rashi explains, chad minayu darish, we're darshaning one of the dams, umashmalei es hadam b'chol makom shu. The understanding is, it says the dam, the blood, wherever it is, b'chol makom shu, shmo olav, wherever it is, it's called by its name, and the point is, v'lo batal, it's not nullified. Yachol ein li elo nisariv be'elu, d'kamar binon min. Maybe we only include situations where it would be fit to offer these karbanos. In other words, in a situation where if the animals while they're alive get mixed up, you can offer them. So maybe only in those scenarios the same can be applied if the bloods get mixed up. For example, let's say if a carbon ola gets mixed up with its substitute or with another ola, tanan b'masnis, and that we learned in the Mishnah. Kachim b'kachim min b'mino. If kachim get mixed up, different owners, but they're the same, they're min b'mino, they're the same kind of carbon. Ze yikrav l'shem mishu, v'zeh yikrav l'shem mishu. You just bring it for whoever the owner is. You don't know who the owner is, but you say, we're bringing it on behalf of whoever the owner is. That's the point over here, that you can even do that if they get mixed up while they're alive. V'chein b'nisarvu b'chulin tamimin, and the same thing, let's say they get mixed up with non-karbanos that have no blemishes, tanan le'el, we learned in the Mishnah earlier. Yimachru ha'chulin l'tzarchei oso hamin, you sell those animals, those chulin animals, for the purpose of bringing the same kind of carbon. V'hader havalu, kachim b'kachim min b'mino, and that becomes a case of kachim b'kachim getting mixed up of the same kind, and so they can be offered. Minayin afilu nesarev b'dam lasham yikrav. Now how do I know that even if the bloods get mixed up with, let's say, the blood of Ola with blood of an Asham, v'afal pi she'eino mino, even though that's not the same kind of carbon, v'im nesarev mechaim lo yakarv, in that case, if the animals would have gotten mixed up while they're alive, they would not be offered. Kedetanan kachim b'kachim min b'she'eino mino yiru, like it says in the Mishnah, if you have kachim b'kachim not of the same kind, they are left to graze. Avias asher nesarev ba'asham mehayribuya gufa. And so then the Brisa said, well, I understand I can use this inclusion to include the case of Asham. V'lo boy krach rina ho'elu shneim kachei kachim. We don't need another pasuk since they're both kachei kachim. V'yafa gavdim nesarev mechaim lo karev. Even though if they were mixed up while alive, they would not be offered. Hasam mishum de'islu takanta b'ri'uhu. That's over there because you have a solution, because you can let them graze. Here you don't have that. Talmud lomar dam dam. That's why it says dam dam. Lahachi itzrichu dam dam trei zimne. That's why it says dam 2 times. Again, to include even in this situation. And the Gemara continues again. We had 3 different psukim to teach the idea of ein olin mevatlin zeh. And so the Gemara now says, V'hani tanoim mivelokach midam hapor midam hasor lo yalfi. Those tanoim who don't want to learn from velokach midam hapor and midam hasor, which is the pasuk by Yom Kippur, why don't they learn from that pasuk this idea of ein olin mevatlin zeh? That's because kasavri, they hold ein ma'arvin lekronos, that you don't actually mix up the blood to apply it to the corners of the mizbeach, meaning to say you actually apply midam hapor midam hasor separately, and therefore you don't have any proof from over there that ein olin mevatlin zeh. And midam dam lo yalef, and those who don't want to learn from dam dam, why not? Because dam dam lo mashmalahu, dam dam, they don't understand it to be a drasha that you can learn from. Ela mi kodesh heim, but those who learn from kodesh heim, or those who don't want to learn rather from kodesh heim, my time lo yalfi, why don't they learn from kodesh heim? What's wrong with that drasha? And the Gemara says, kasavri, they hold kodesh heim. You learn something else from kodesh heim. You learn from kodesh heim that heim kareven, that they are offered, ve'ein temurasam kreva, you don't bring the temura, their substitute. This pasuk again is by Bechor, and it's saying that the temura of Bechor is not offered on the mizbeach. Rashi explains, V'hani tanoi lashon bayahu, this is a question. V'hanach telasa tanoi defligu b'meilaf l'olin shein mevatlan zeh. These 3 tanoim that argue in terms of where we learn out that we say that olin are not mevatel one another. Mitalasa kroi, 3 different psukim, b'shlama kulu, I understand all of them. Mi v'lokach midam apor midam asor lo yalfi, they won't learn, let's say, from v'lokach midam apor midam asor. Kosavri trei tanoi, so those 2 tanoim hold, the shmaitin ein ma'arvin, dam por v'soyer, dam por v'soyer, l'matan dom, karnos ha-mizbeach ha'pnimi, that you don't actually mix the bloods for the application to the corners of the inner mizbeach. Umay v'lokach midam apor midam asor, what does it mean that you take from the blood of the bull and the blood of the he-goat? Mizeh b'fnei atzmo, you take it independently, each blood, you don't mix the bloods together. Uplug said Rabbi Yonasan and Rabbi Yoshia, he b'Meseches Yuma, this is a machlokas between Rabbi Yonasan and Rabbi Yoshia in Meseches Yuma. And Rashi continues, V'hai midam dam lo mashma lahu l'tana da'akometz l'tana da'kodeshem. Again, those other 2 tanoim that don't learn from dam dam, they don't see that as a drasha that can be darshaned. Elami kodeshem, but when it comes to the pasuk of kodeshem by Bechor, why not learn from there? And the answer is vein tmuras and kreva, that's to teach something else. It's to teach that the substitute is not offered. V'lo l'midrash be b'havayasan yehu asa, not to make the drasha again of b'havayasan yehu, but rather to make this drasha instead, and therefore we don't learn out this idea of ein mevatlin, that when it comes to olin, they're not mevatel one another. And the Gemara continues, V'idach, and the other Tana, the one who does learn from Kodesh Heim, that again, they're not mevatel one another, so where's that Tana going to learn out ein tmuras and kreva by Bechor? Nafkale mevim shurim sel Hashem hu, it says in the pasuk hu, so it means hu karev, it is brought, ve'ein tmuraso kreva, but its substitute is not offered. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, coming here, another proof from my brisa, again, in terms of whether the area where the shirayim, the remainder blood, is poured to the base of the Mizbeach, if you apply blood to the lower half of the Mizbeach and it drips down to the base of the Mizbeach, is that the same thing? The brisa says, Nasan lamala velo nimlach, let's say the bloods get mixed up, and he applies the bloods to the upper half of the Mizbeach without asking, so then at that point in time, Elu ve'elu modim, then they both agree, meaning both the Chachamim and Rabbi Eliezer agree, sheyachzor v'yitin lamata, that at that point, you just take the blood and you apply it to the lower half of the Mizbeach, and Elu ve'elu olin lo, and then both are going to be accepted. And so the Gemara says, my lav is it not? What is this brisa talking about? Diyarev chatos va'ola. What happened was as follows. You had blood of a chatos and blood of an ola got mixed up. And again, the blood of the chatas is supposed to be applied to the upper half, the ola to the lower half, and then this person applied the blood to the upper half. So what happens now? Once he applied it to the upper half, shirayim. So now you have shirayim, you have remainder blood from the carbon chatas. V'katani, and it says ve'elu modim, that everybody agrees that you apply the blood to the lower half. Ushma minan, don't we see from here makam ola, makam shirayim, that the area where you apply the blood of the ola is the same as the shirayim, because essentially you're at that point fulfilling both. You take the blood, you apply it to the lower half of the mizbeach, and that will count whatever ola blood is there, that will count for the application of the ola, and whatever drips down that's from the chatos blood, that will count for the shirayim. And the Gemara continues, Ki Yasser Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef Amar, when Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef came, he said, Amri b'ma'arava, they say in the west, they say in Eretz Yisrael, Hacha b'mayaskinan, here, what are we dealing with in this brisa? Kagon diyarev chatas hachitzona b'shirayim. The case over here is that an outer chatas was mixed with shirayim. And Rashi explains, Hacha b'mayaskinan, here in the brisa, what are we dealing with? Reisha de plugsa, in the beginning of the brisa, where there's a machlokus between the Chacham and Rabbi Eliezer, and the Shinuya Nuschos takes out the words Lamata lechatchila. So that beginning of the brisa is Kagon diyarev tchilas chatas hachitzona b'shiyare chatas hapnimis. What happened is that the initial blood that's supposed to be applied by an outer chatas, that got mixed up with the remainder blood of an inner chatas. That's the case of the brisa. Dinu shirayim stama. So when it comes to the remainder of the chatas hapnimis, so those are shirayim, that's remainder blood. Hilkach, therefore, as follows: Nasan lamala. Let's say this blood that got mixed up, he applies it to the upper half of the mizbeach. V'lo nimlach. He never asks the question of what to do. And why does it have to be that he did it without asking? Di nimlach, because if he would have asked in the first place, the Rabbanan yishafech, the Rabbanan would have said it has to be poured down the drain of the azara. Tehavalu nitanim bifnim shechazar v'nasan mehem b'chutz b'kranos, because it would be a situation where you have blood that's supposed to be applied inside, and then he goes ahead and he applies it b'chutz, he applies it outside by the corners. V'havesh shelo b'makomo, would essentially be applied in the wrong place. Avol mechin nasan lamala, but when he already goes ahead and does apply it to the upper half, Havel shirayim v'shirayim. At that point in time, it's now all shirayim. You have leftover, you have remainder from the outer chatos, and you have remainder from the inner chatos. Ushnei and biyasod, and both of them go to the same place. They go to the base of the mizbeach. Uchi Rabbi Yishmael, and that follows what Rabbi Yishmael holds. The Yamar who says zev v'zeh yisod ma'aravi. They both go to the western yisod. Uchi Rabbi Shimon, or it could follow Rabbi Shimon. The Yamar zev v'zeh yisod dromi le'el, who says that both go to the yisod dromi, the southern base of the mizbeach. But the point is, in this particular situation, the blood that got mixed up, again, had they asked the question initially, so according to the Chachamim would have said that it needs to be poured down the drain of the Azara, but once it was already applied to the upper half of the Mizbeach, so now at that point in time, everything that remains is supposed to go to the Yesod of the Mizbeach, and so therefore, again, it can all be poured to the Yesod of the Mizbeach. That was the meaning of the Brisa. But the Gemara continues and asks, Amarle Abaya, Abaya said to him, V'nei mamar, once you're giving this answer already, you're saying that the case of the Brisa is that the blood of a chatas hachitzona got mixed up with the shirayim of a chatas hapnimis, so say something simpler. The master should simply say, Kagon diyarev b'shireho, that the case actually is that you have the blood of a chatas chitzona getting mixed up with the remainder of a chatas chitzona. Why do you have to make it the remainder of an inner chatas? Just make it the remainder of an outer chatas. It would be exactly the same situation. This would be a situation situation again where the outer chatas blood is supposed to be applied on the upper half of the mizbeach, and then the remainder blood is supposed to be poured to the base of the mizbeach. The Rabbanan L'chatzchila would advise that it should all be poured down the drain, but if it's applied to the upper half of the mizbeach, it would be exactly the same halacha. Now you would have two remainder bloods, and you would pour them both to the base of the mizbeach. That would even be a simpler situation, because there clearly it's all remainder from an outer chatas. It all is supposed to be poured to the exact same part of the yesod of the mizbeach. So why not just make it that simpler case? Why, when we're answering this question, do we set it up that again it's the initial blood of a chatas hachitzona with the shirayim of an inner chatas? In what way do we gain from that? And the Gemara makes a suggestion, Dilma maybe, hakamash malon, it's coming to teach us that afilu l'madamar shirayim ma'akvin, that even according to the one who says that the remainder blood is ma'akev, you have to pour it to the base of the mizbeach, but chosru ein ma'akvin, it's teaching us that if some of it is missing, that is not a requirement, that doesn't make a difference. And over here, some of it is missing because, again, it was applied to the upper half of the mizbeach. You don't have all of those shirayim. Maybe that's what we're teaching over here. Rashi explains, "V'leima marka gon diariv chatas hachitzona b'shirayim kolomar," means to say b'shiyarei chitzona kamosa. Let it be that the outer chatas blood gets mixed up with remainder outer chatas blood, exactly like it. Tahachi shaper tzvei, that would be much simpler. Shamakam shirei and shavel divrei hakol. Everybody agrees the place where you would pour those shirayim are the same. So dilma hakamash malon, maybe what it's teaching us is hay deukma af b'shiyarei pnimis. The reason why we're trying to establish it, even in a scenario where it gets mixed up with the remainder blood from an inner chatos, the afilu l'man da'amar shirayim hapnimiyim ma'akvi, means to say as follows, even according to the one who says the inner remainder blood is ma'akiv, is required, hanimili kilo yoiv minayomidi, that's if you don't pour any of that remainder blood. Aval chasru miksasim, but let's say some of that is missing, some of that remainder blood, liachar matan damim hapnimiyim, meaning after you apply the blood to the inner mizbeach, some of it went missing, ein hachisar ma'akev. We're trying to teach that doesn't make a difference. The fact that some is missing is not a problem. V'shofei chashar liyaso, the rest can be poured to the base of the mizbeach. Dehahacha chasru shirayim hapnimiyim b'shanasan dvei lamala. Here you are missing some of that inner remainder blood because you had to apply it to the upper half of the mizbeach, again because of the outer chatos. V'afilu hachi miskashri, and nevertheless it is kosher. And indeed, the Gemara accepts that possibility. And the Gemara continues, Amarle Rava Tosfa Ravina. Rava Tosfa said to Ravina, Ha'ukimna ahi, but didn't we already establish this case, Beruba El Yonim, that the case is where the majority of the blood is blood that's supposed to be applied to the upper half of the Mizbeach? Meaning, when we understood this case initially, that it's talking about Chatas blood and Ola blood getting mixed up, didn't we say earlier that the case specifically is it's a majority Chatas blood? And the case was that you applied on the upper half of the Mizbeach the amount of the lower blood and a little bit more, and that's why in this situation we actually said that you did not fulfill the lower blood in this case, and so therefore once we said that, so it doesn't prove anything. Why are we even bringing this as a proof? The Brisa is not talking at all about applying the blood to the lower half of the Mizbeach, and that should count for both the lower blood and the yesod of the Mizbeach. Rashi explains, Vo Kimna, V'hadaka yoyev lamata, we said, when we explained this Brisa earlier, we said that when you're applying it on the lower half, l'shem shiyarei chatas hu dekayoyev. We said earlier in the Gemara that that's just talking about only the remainder blood of the chatas. Aval ola lo miskasher. We explained earlier that the lower blood of the ola, that was not actually kosher. Tahayoyev lamala shir tachtonon, because we had suggested earlier that the entire measure of the lower blood has already been applied possibly on the upper half. V'yodi nami mukmis la betaroves chatas viola lo shmamina makam ola makam shirayim. And so the point is, even if we do say this brisa is, as we initially understood, that it's talking about chatas blood mixed with ola blood, it wouldn't teach us anything about the fact that the area where you apply ola blood is good for shirayim, is good for remainder. Dekema de ola lo miskasher, because if we're saying that the ola blood is not kosher anyway, lo zaraklu b'makam ola, so he's not going to throw it in the area where you apply ola blood. Ela beitztava, he's going to pour it right directly onto the base of the mizbeach. Umay doch ge lo ukma bechatas v'shirayim. So why do we have to start saying that this brisa is actually talking about chatas and shirayim, just say again it's talking about ola blood, and it's talking about chatas blood as well. Didn't we say earlier that the ola blood is not accepted, which would then make this brisa not a proof to anything in terms of the area where shirayim are supposed to be poured? That's the question over here of Rava Tosfa, which he says to Ravina. Didn't we say we're talking about Ruba Elyonim? And again, he applies to the upper half, the Shir Tachtonim V'yod. And the Gemara responds, Amarle said back to him, Hani mili lamanda amru me kara ein bila. That was, when we gave that answer, that was according to the one who said ein bila, that the bloods don't mix. That was the whole point of giving that answer. Essentially, the Gemara over here is reviewing the earlier Gemara. We said according to that manda amar, so then you really do have a problem. If we say ein bila, the bloods might not mix well, so then what you apply in the upper half, it might not even contain upper half blood. And so we had to say again that we're talking where you apply the entire measure of the lower half and a little bit more. That's where we said that. But maskana, but in the conclusion of the Gemara, because those pligi, we said that they're arguing where the blood got mixed up in individual cups, not that the blood actually mixed with the blood's actually mixed together, but that just we don't know which cup belongs to which. And so in that situation, again, as we said earlier, then we're able to say in such a case, it would seem to prove the ola blood would actually be accepted on the lower half of the mizbeach if they're both applied to the lower half of the mizbeach, and so it would seemingly prove that the area of the shirayim is the same as the area of the application of the ola blood. And Rashi explains, Amarle said to him, Hani mili hanach shenuye deshanina le'el. All those answers we gave earlier, that was l'mayda havesagadaitach meikara to bibolo pligi. That was again according to what we had thought then, that they're arguing where the bloods actually mixed together. V'hava madrina nashinuye dechike. We're trying to find forced answers. L'ukame l'deravashi, for Ravashi, according to his approach, to Amar l'Rabbi Eliezer ein bila, who says according to Rabbi Eliezer, they don't mix. When they mix together, they don't fully mix. The lo tikshi lehachmas naisa. That was just so that brisa shouldn't be a difficulty to Ravashi. But maskana deshinuyim, but in the conclusion, hadar naban, again we retracted, this was earlier, v'kimna l'shinoi deplugsa didhu b'hach masnisa b'taruvas kozosu. We said actually it's talking over there about a mixing up of the cups. Umitarvayu kam Rabbi Eliezer deleisev lamala ulamat, and you take from both cups on the upper half and the lower half, u'shnei and kasher, and they actually are both kosher. V'hecha denasan lamala v'lo nimlach, and therefore, if you applied it above without asking a question what to do, divrei hakol yitin lamata, then you will apply both bloods on the lower half, ve'elu alu, and they both will be accepted. V'hava muki lo Rav Yehuda b'chatas v'ola hava kashalei, and therefore if Rav Yehuda would say this brisa was talking about chatas and ola, again this would be a difficulty because it would seem that the makam shirayim is the same as the makam ola. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Hanitanin bifnim. Let's say you have karbanos where the blood is to be applied inside the Beis Hamikdash, shenisarvu b'nitanin b'chutz, and that gets mixed up with blood that's supposed to be applied to the outer mizbeach. So there yishafchu la'ama. There you have to pour the bloods down the drain of the azara. Nasan b'chutz v'chazar v'nasan bifnim. Let's say the person didn't do that. Instead, he applied the blood first to the outer mizbeach and then applied it to the inner mizbeach. Kosher, so that would still be kosher. Bifnim v'chazar v'nasan b'chutz. Let's say he first applies it to the inner mizbeach and then applies it to the outer mizbeach. So here we have a machlokas tanoim. Rabbi Akiva posel. Rabbi Akiva says it's disqualified in such a case, meaning that which was applied to the outer mizbeach is disqualified. The chachamim machshirim, and the chachamim say it is kosher. Rabbi Akiva Omer, because Rabbi Akiva says kol damim shenichnasu lechaper behechol, any blood that's supposed to be on the outer mizbeach that goes into the hechol as a kapara psul, and it is going to be disqualified. That will disqualify that blood. The chachamim Omer, and the chachamim say chatos bilvad. That's not true by all damim. It's true only by an outer chatos. If you have an outer chatos, that blood goes inside the hechol. That's a problem, but otherwise it's not a problem. It's not a problem. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Rabbi Eliezer says afa osham. It's also true by the osham, meaning according to Rabbi Eliezer, both the chatos and the osham, which are supposed to be applied to the outer mizbeach, if that blood goes inside the hechol, that is going to be disqualified. Shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, kachatos ka'osham. The chatos is like the osham; they're the same, and again that's applied in this regard. Rashi explains hanitanim b'fnim yishvchu la'ama, the less lunro, and the reason why in a situation again where the inner blood gets mixed with the outer blood, the reason it has to be poured down the drain is because we don't don't hold of rowan. We don't hold that we can just view, let's say you would just apply it all to the outer mizbeach, we'll just view the inner blood as if it's water. We don't hold of that. You can't deviate what you do with this blood because you want to make kosher the other blood. Now the Gemara will ask on this, why doesn't Rabbi Eliezer argue on this Mishnah? Because he does hold of rowan. So why does this Mishnah simply say it's not allowed? Rabbi Eliezer should argue. Rabbi Akiva posel bechitzon. Again, the Mishnah said in a situation where you applied all of the blood inside first, Rabbi Akiva would then say the blood that was applied outside is posel. V'chachamim machshirin, and the chachamim say kosher. That means bechol karbanos. All karbanos they would say it's kosher inside and outside. If you had applied the blood inside and then outside, it would all be kosher. Chutz mechatas hachitzona, with the exception of the outer chatas, the mifsala, that actually would be posel. Mishum v'chol chatas asher yuva, because again it says in the pasuk, if you have outer chatas that's brought into the heichal, that is going to be a disqualification if that blood again is brought into the heichal. And the Gemara says, "V'niflog nami Rabbi Eliezer b'ha." This is the question that Rashi just alluded to. Why doesn't Rabbi Eliezer argue in this Mishnah as well? He should say rowan. And the Gemara says to that, "Well, heichi liyavid." In this case, what exactly will we do? Nesev b'chutz v'hadr nesev lifnim. If you're first going to apply the blood to the outer mizbeach and then the inner mizbeach, that's a problem lechatchila. Kashem shemitzvah lahaktim elyonim letachtonim. Just like there's a mitzvah to first apply the upper blood and then the lower blood, kach mitzvah, so too it's a mitzvah lahaktim penim lachutz, to first apply the inner blood and then the outer blood. So to do it in that direction is not going to work, according to Rabbi Eliezer. Rashi explains, Kashem shemitzvah lahaktim elyonim letachtonim dam chatas ledam ola. It means that the blood of a chatas should be applied before the blood of an ola. Kedamar b'chol hatadir, as we will say in kol hatadir. Kach mitzvah lahaktim pnim lachutz. It's also a mitzvah that the inner blood should go before the outer blood, to pnim chashav, because the inner blood is more important. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Pei Beis Amud Aleph.